Hey, Bastich B for 64K, and welcome to a new special called Wrestling with Pixels. And welcome back. So today we're going to have a look at the book called Wrestling with Pixels. We're going to talk about wrestling games past and present and chat with the author and friend of the channel, Audie Sorlie, about this book. So this book was put out by Hardcore Gaming 101, who have put out many excellent, affordable books. This one clocks in at around 250 pages and covers wrestling games right from the beginning in 1983 right up to about 2017. So before we start chatting to Audie about this book, let's take a closer look at it. Like I said earlier, I'm joined today by Audie Sorlie of Limited Run Games and Digital Foundry. We'll be chatting not only about this book, but good old wrestling games in general. The first thing I asked Audie is how long it took him to put this book together with over 300 wrestling reviews.
Hello, I am Audie Sorlie, and I was the writer of Wrestling with Pixels, a world tour to wrestling video games. This is a bit of a complicated story. Technically, the book has existed in different forms before the one that I did eventually release. It was a very difficult project to kind of figure out for both financial reasons and personal reasons. Around 2009, 2010, I was working and writing with Destructoid at the time, the website Destructoid, and I was in the position where I was doing a lot of interviews with developers, and many times when I was interviewing people or talking to them, just for how my brain works, I would remember that, like, hey, I think you worked on a wrestling game back in the day, or I was interviewing them about a wrestling game. So it just kind of happened that I found these stories pretty compelling, and I found the history of the genre to be pretty compelling because in many ways it was the very first versus fighter that was ever made in Data East tag team wrestling, and just felt like that this genre has a lot more story to it than simply, Hulk Hogan, Ric Flair, these people being on your screen. There was much more to it than just saying, wrestling is a popular sport, Hulkamania happens, blows up. It was a genre and it was a sport that actually kind of blossomed and started growing up at the same time as the HAL consoles were coming out, so they grew up together in a way. But wrestling, it all changed in the 80s, and it became this flamboyant and theatrical TV drama.
That's when I'm gonna strip it away from you. Pull the plug on your life support system. I'll be the new champion of the WWE. And what you gonna do when Hulkamania and the largest arms in the world destroy you?
With good versus evil, which was always the basis of the sport, but and now it was much more colorful and it was much more defined by these kind of Saturday morning antics of WWF.
Yeah, Hulk Hogan, I remember way back when the Mega Powers were bonded. Yeah, you made a lot of promises to the Macho Man, didn't you? Promises that you didn't keep.
So I just felt that it was an interesting story to tell how the genre grew up with the birth of video games coming to be. The actual book had 3 drafts. Finally, I settled on the way it is now, which is a chronological story of every single wrestling game, and not just the wrestling games, but also all the pachinkos, all the LCDs, all the pinballs, all the merchandise, just everything. All in all, took about, could say it took 10 years, but I want to sound better than that, so I'm gonna say it took like 5 to 6 years before it finally went through editing and finished up.
We interrupt our program to bring you this important message.
This book really made me think long and hard about my personal history with wrestling games. For me, wrestling games all started in 1985 when I played Rock and Wrestle on my trusty Commodore 64, a game released by Melbourne House, not long after their Versus classic, The Way of the Exploding Fist. I also managed to get Tag Team Wrestling, based on the original Data East arcade game, in their arcade collection not long after that, which was released for the C64 as well, plus a host of other awesome Commodore wrestlers. Until that time at a bowling alley when I played Technos' WWF WrestleFest in the early 90s in the arcades, which was a truly amazing experience. It not only managed to bring the gameplay, but also all of the spectacle of wrestling TV of the day. My fascination with wrestling kind of faded after that, as my love of Hong Kong action movies came back big time, and I drowned myself in the likes of John Woo, Jet Li, and the best of classic Jackie Chan movies. But that wrestling bug came back big time in the mid-90s, probably sparked by playing Capcom's Saturday Night Slam Masters and wrestling's big presence on South African TV at the time, as we all used to gather around on Saturday nights to watch the latest SmackDown, with some of my favorite characters like The Undertaker, the Heartbreak Kid, and later the attitude-fueled Stone Cold Steve Austin, which prompted me getting WWF the arcade game and All Japan Pro Wrestling on my Sega Saturn and diving back into the love of the genre. It's funny how reading a few reviews in a book can unlock so many great memories that I just hadn't thought of in decades, like attending an amateur wrestling show a few years ago with friends and meeting the man himself, Jerry the King Lawler. Wrestling is always associated with good times.
So now let's look at the game reviews and how they set out. So I asked Audie, with the 300 plus reviews in this book, how many did he actually write?
I wrote about 98% myself. The only things I did not write in the end was some of the later, I call them the SmackDown games, but I mean now the 2K game. At the time, those games were going through very little change from entry to entry, and in fact they were removing some features. It just got kind of soul-crushing to sit and play these wrestling games that were not fun to play whatsoever in any way. In present times, there was just much less to say about them, even when I met the developers at 2K, which were wonderful people. But yeah, so most of it is written by me, from people who may know me from Digital Foundry and place like that, playing games on real hardware is essential for me. There's several cases, especially when it came to arcade games, like kind of misconceptions of how the game sounds and runs came from using games on MAME. So it's very important that every game, regardless of which platform, was sought out and played. So I did that and amassed a incredible collection of them, which I paid for out of my own pocket, which was nearly the financial ruin of me, to see every game in its original packaging, which I could then scan into the book, because most, if not all, except for some of the arcade stuff, is actually my own scans from real copies. And you say 300 reviews, but in fact I played every version of every game, so it was actually much closer to something like 660 something. Actually, I remember 66 something. It was a lot of games.
I've been wrestling for 10 years! And I've done it all! And I've paid all the dues I'm gonna pay! And if you think for 1 minute that you guys are gonna walk around telling the world that Ric Flair has done, you're out of your mind!
The history of wrestling games is pretty fascinating, so let's take a little trip down memory lane and check out the beginnings of the genre.
It's a lie, Hulk Hogan, and that's enough to get me out!
The first ever wrestling game was released in 1983 called Tag Team Wrestling by Technos and distributed by Data East worldwide in the arcades. It's also known as Big Pro Wrestling in Japan. It mixes action and turn-based styled combat for its moves, which include all your favorites from pile drivers to drop kicks. The game was partly directed by arcade legend himself, Yoshihisa Kishimoto, who would later go on and make River City Ransom, Double Dragon, and Renegade. Considering this is the first wrestling game ever, it's quite impressive, with nice presentation similar to Daddy East's next game, Karate Champ, and lots of dodgy speech samples like all arcades of this era. I'd never given much thought as to what was the first wrestling game, but being this was a game I played quite a bit in the arcades until I got my Commodore 64 version, it's always nice to look back and pay respects. It attempted a lot, like tag team fights, and even taking the action outside the ring, with the opponent's dodgy manager also trying to whack you with his pimp cane. It's simple, but truly captures the spirit of wrestling, and at its core it's a game worth trying out to experience the roots of the genre.
So this book doesn't only cover wrestling video games, it also covers obscure Japanese pachinko machines and even those dodgy LCD games. I asked Audie what was his idea about adding these into the book.
Okay, so in terms of inclusion, handheld LCD games. So I told you earlier that I made the decision that I wanted basically the book to be a chronological, complete overview of the entire genre, and not just reviewing the games, but if you actually do read every individual game that I wrote about, you get a sense that there is more of a story to it being told. So when it came to the handheld LCD games, it was very important to include them because the very first wrestling game ever is in fact an LCD game from Bandai called Big Pro Wrestling. So that's kind of where that decision was made. It should be said though that I probably could have left some things out in hindsight, though. For example, doing pachinko was probably the craziest stories I have at all from doing this book. I went to Japan about 3 or 4 times. I actually did seek out every single pachinko machine I could find based on wrestlers, as well as arcade machines, anything running on real hardware. For example, I was in Nasakusabashi and going into a pachinko parlor because I'd heard there was an Antonio Inoki pachinko machine, and so I found it. But at the same time as I was starting to take pictures and such, there was a larger gentleman grabbed my shoulder and literally tugged me kind of across the floor with his one hand, yelling at me kind of what I was doing there. And I explained to my best, to the best of my abilities in Japanese. I was doing research for this wrestling video game book, not quite sure what to do with you other than to beat you up probably. And then this much smaller statured man came out with a kind of sly smile on his face, and what I remember the most is that he had this rockabilly kind of Elvis Presley look. Just looked pretty good. He spoke with a southern accent, but he didn't really speak English, so he kind of, it was clear that he was listening to some sort of rockabilly music or even Elvis music. I mean, that is a genre that still is beloved over there. He tried to speak to me in English with this very strange southern accent, and I answered, again, kind of explaining what I was doing there, and then he gave me a good pat on the shoulder and said, very cool, very cool, something like that. And then he pointed at the door for the exit and said, don't come back. So, even though I did not get beat up, I was sent very politely out the door rather than being thrown out. You know, it's 3 pages? Something like that. And for each of those machines that I'm telling you about, I actually did track them down in Japan just because I wanted to see the machine, I wanted to hear it, I wanted to, just... It is a pachinko machine, but there could be something to it. I guess in some way someone probably needs that information.
We interrupt our program to bring you this important message.
So my personal pet peeve with books like this covering the history of something is usually the complete disregard for computer games. It's usually very Nintendo-centric, like nothing else in the world ever existed. I can happily say that this book concludes computer games as well, as Audie was raised on the Commodore 64 like myself. So I asked him how important it was for him to include those as well.
So this was incredibly important to me for several reasons. Now, of course, I already mentioned how important it was for me to have a complete story and a complete look on this whole genre and every crazy turn that it took, even when it goes into like actor-specific stuff like Hulk Hogan and Suburban Commando, that's in there. The Rock and Spy Hunter, that's in there, just because it has kind of like a loose connection. And when it came to the computer stuff, it was incredibly important to me because I actually grew up with the C64 and the Amiga. And today, even when in my day job at Limited Run and things like this, it's so important for me to kind of bring the knowledge of those platforms to North American audiences especially, because it's, for North Americans, this is kind of just curiosities often. It's just like, oh, there was like this weird Commodore 64 version of a game. But for millions and millions of people in Europe and South Africa, it's like these kinds of games were the ones we grew up with. As important as an NES version would be, or as a Super Nintendo version would be. And I really wanted to make sure that all of those got in there. And if you look at the C64, Commodore 64 itself, as well as the Amiga, those had exclusive wrestling games that never came out anywhere else. This has been archived, this has been preserved, and so it's in the book. So there was a lot of interesting stuff that was like Commodore 64 specific, which was really exciting for me because I grew up with it, and just sitting down playing them and discovering all these weird ways that they got around limitations was really, really interesting.
I'm a huge fan of Suda51, the game designer. A lot of people don't know that he started out working at Human on the Fire Pro Wrestling games. I had to ask Audie what it was like to interview him for the book.
It's interesting. It's always interesting with Suda51. I've been fortunate enough to get to know him throughout my career and deal with him in different capacities. So getting him to talk to me for this book was actually quite easy. It was important though to get Suda's perspective on it, because while here in the West I don't think we realize so much, but his take on Super Fire Pro Wrestling and what he did with the story mode, which has been told by me and other people now, with the kind of shocking twist in the story mode in the third game, but also his fandom of wrestling, just his knowledge and his kind of passion for it. Play No More Heroes and you would know that it still burns pretty bright within him, his love for wrestling. It was really fun sitting down, talk to him about it, and I think most of the time we talked, and subsequently we have talked when we meet each other. He's always just kind of mesmerized by the fact that I know this much about wrestling video games, especially on Japanese wrestling video games, and I'm a huge fan of Japanese wrestling itself.
The way you looked at me, man, I could see the demons in your eyes then.
So we're both going to now give you 3 wrestling games to check out. Audie's going to give you 3 entry-level ones that can get you into wrestling games if you've never really got into them. And I'm going to give you my personal favorite 3 of all time across any system.
I would say that if you're someone that doesn't have much interest in the sport of wrestling at all, and kind of want to check it out just to dabble your head into it because you like fighting games, for example, the Muscle Bomber from Capcom is excellent because you'll have your Street Fighter inputs, you'll have that graphical style, you have characters from the universe of Street Fighter like Mike Hagar from Final Fight, so you kind of have these comforts that you can lean on even if wrestling isn't your thing. Of course, I would be hounded for not saying that the N64 wrestlers, be it WCW NWO Revenge, or WWF No Mercy, or even Virtual Pro Wrestling 2. Those are pretty good if you have friends over concentrated mayhem that comes with that. A lot of backstabbing, it can be a lot of drama, and it can be a lot of just kind of visceral action. It's really good. It's a good question, but I would have to say that now with all of the kind of modding and activity around it, Fire Pro Wrestling World, which you can get on Steam and PS4, it is very satisfying. And again, you can kind of liken it to a 2D fighter and how you go into training mode. So once you just sit down with it, kind of figure out the timing system, it's an endless amount of fun you can have in that. And I think can be, as well as an entry-level game, all that kind of stuff makes it very friendly to new players. And there's other wrestling games on the horizon, some that I know of that hasn't been announced even. So there's a lot to be excited about if you're a wrestling video game fan, and I guess maybe in 20 years I'll have to update this book to include those games.
My 3 favorite wrestlers would have to be Rock and Wrestle on the Commodore 64, All Japan Pro Wrestling featuring Virtua on the Sega Saturn, and WWF the arcade game. Rock and Wrestle came out a year after Technos' Tag Team Wrestling, so it's vintage. And while it lacks in theatric representation of the sport, it more than makes up for in easy-to-control movesets, fantastic sound effects, and a colorful cast of characters. Considering its age, it's really quite impressive. All Japan Pro Wrestling featuring Virtua is a very fun, easy to get to grips with wrestler on the Japanese Sega Saturn, where you can not only control famous Japanese wrestlers, but also Wolf and Jeffrey from Virtua Fighter. It has a massive moveset, fun to play, well animated, and is totally worth your time. And lastly is WWF the arcade game by Midway, which is a combination of wrestler and Mortal Kombat mechanics with great graphics and completely over-the-top moves that play up the theatric atmosphere of TV wrestling, while still giving you simple combos to learn with devastating results, and is super fun in the 2-player versus mode.
Listen to this, Hulk Hogan. I hate you. I hate your guts. And that's what's gonna be left all over the mat after WrestleMania 5.
And that's it. This book is available on Amazon, and I'll leave links in the description. I just want to thank you and Audie for joining me today for this little nostalgia look at the history of wrestling and this excellent book. Thanks for joining me, Bastich B, at 64K. I hope you had a good time. And if you can please like and subscribe, that'll be greatly appreciated. And I'll see you next time. Cheers.
What?